To my left, speaking second, is Professor Joseph Orosco. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. He's the co-director of the Anarchism Project for Alternative Futures. He's the director of the Peace Studies program, and he teaches and writes about issues of peace, nonviolence, political theory, and pragmatism. He's also the author of the book Cesar Chavez and the Common Sense of Nonviolence.
Well, thank you all. I'm very honored to be here as the single philosopher on this esteemed panel of historians. And I was very honored when Chris asked me to be on here, and I really tried to figure out what I might be able to contribute to this discussion, since I am not a historian. But one thing I have always been interested in World War I, partly because this conflict made a very big impact on American philosophy. This war impacted very much in terms of the grand figures of American philosophy in the early part of the 20th century. This was a conflict in which they thought a lot about in terms of the meaning of it, and particularly the role of the United States and how it should become or not a part of this conflict. And so there is a great debate between the American pragmatist John Dewey and his student Ronald Bourne. I've written a little bit on the work of Josiah Royce and his involvement in thinking about the meaning of World War I. And so I thought when I first came here I would talk about that. But then I realized that my esteemed colleague, Professor Nichols here, has written quite a bit about Dewey and Bourne, and so I didn't want to be shown up, and I thought, I gotta figure out a different controversy, or else I'm gonna look silly talking about this stuff. And so I love obscure controversies and obscure intellectual trends. And so I found a debate between two anarchist philosophers in the early part of the war, talking about the meaning of the war and whether or not radical social progressive folk should support the war or not, and on what terms. And what we need to understand, of course, is that anarchism as a political philosophy was a vibrant movement at the end of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. There were millions of people around the world dedicated to this political philosophy about trying to overthrow some kind of state authority and establish some form of radical democracy. And so this political philosophy motivated and energized movements all around the world. And in Europe, this was quite a popular sort of ideology to fall behind. And socialists and anarchists were arguing with one another about the proper way in which liberation would be brought about from the absolutist powers that were in Europe at the time. And so a debate happened in the fall, starting in the fall of 1914, between Pyotr Kropotkin. I have to do this joke for one of my anarchist colleagues, Tony Vogt. Pyotr Kropotkin, if you don't know, was actually an aristocrat. He was a prince. And so amongst anarchist circles, Kropotkin is referred to as the anarchist formerly known as a prince. So Kropotkin penned a letter in 1914 to a colleague, Gustav Stefan, who was a Swedish professor. Stefan asked him, "What is your view of the war, Kropotkin?" Kropotkin was considered to be one of the preeminent intellectual scholars of anarchism at the time. And so Kropotkin pens this letter to him, and his response is that it's the duty of all people interested in liberation and in radical ideals to help defeat the Germans and their aggression across Europe. And so anarchists must become involved in the war. And the reason that Kropotkin gave for this was that what he saw was that the victory of Germany in this conflict would be utterly disastrous for all of Europe. His view was that the origin of World War I came from the remnants of the Franco-Prussian conflict in 1870, that Germany had become unified and saw that it had this stature because of its military prowess, and it started to grow as a military power. And the result was an arms race all across Europe trying to militarize their own countries, to protect themselves from Germany's militarization. So these arms races start to come around the sort of fortification of Europe because of the rise of Germany. And the fall, particularly what was interesting about the Franco-Prussian conflict was that France at the time right before it was routed by Germany, right, defeated the attempt by French workers in Paris to set up the Paris Commune, which was this experiment in radical democracy. And part of the war effort of France against Germany in 1870-1871 was trying to fend off Germany, but also to make sure that internal security and internal stability could be maintained. And you couldn't have a bunch of crazy radicals running around Paris claiming that they were going to set up a workers' state and try to manage things in some kind of direct consensual democracy. And so the Paris Commune was put down by the French government. And so for Kropotkin, this was a sign that Germany stood for everything that radical people interested in justice should be against, right? Germany had to be defeated because it propped up militarism in Germany, in Europe. It was making arms races take root in order to fend off German aggression. And it gave legitimacy to absolutist powers in Russia and in Austria-Hungary. So if we could see Germany as a power, this only gave some sort of credence to those powers that they were on the right track of being very firm and squelching dissent, and that militarization was the route to power in Europe. And so Kropotkin believed that the rise of Germany and its military push across Europe was just bad for all sorts of forms of radical democracy and liberation. And so Germany had to be stopped. And in 1916, he was asked by a fellow anarchist from France, Jean Grau, to pen a manifesto. And the manifesto came out, the Manifesto of the 16, of 16 prominent members of the European anarchist movement. And the arguments that the manifesto lays out are essentially what Kropotkin laid out in the letter to Stefan. But what he added, that is what Kropotkin added in writing the Manifesto of the 16, was that there was a warning to German workers and German people in the Manifesto of the 16. Kropotkin said, look, by not working internally to topple your government and to prevent the war effort, you as a people become complicit in the crimes against humanity that your government is enacting. And so in trying to defeat Germany, we can't simply say that this is a war of elites, because if the German people are not trying to oppose their government and are buying into the nationalism of the German state, they also too become complicit in any of the crimes that the military carries out. And so in his view, right, he concludes this way, Kropotkin says, Germany represents a threat to human evolution itself. That is, the movement of progress towards enlightenment, towards liberation, towards democracy for all people depends on Germany being defeated in World War I.
There's no contemporary morals for this, is there?
Well, that's the interesting thing about this, right? The sort of global perspective, like Chris was talking about, how we're starting to see more sorts of emphasis on the global perspective of this conflict. And what I think is interesting about the anarchist debates about this is that they were very conscious of this very early on in 1914. So for instance, the response to the Manifesto of the 16 by the majority of the anarchist community in Europe was quite negative. Most of the anarchists said, what has happened to Kropotkin? Right? He's bought into all the nationalist rhetoric by the capitalist bourgeoisie about the Germans, and what's happened to him? He's gone crazy. And in particular, a response was penned by an Italian anarchist by the name of Enrico Malatesta, who was a colleague of Emma Goldman and Arthur Berkman and other sorts of very prominent American anarchists in the United States. And what Malatesta argued in 1914 and 1916 is that Kropotkin had made serious conceptual mistakes in his analysis that good anarchists should never make, he said. And so first he said, this is Malatesta, he said, look, Kropotkin speaks of nations as homogeneous units with common interests that can be opposed to one another, Germany, France, England. And with his remarks about the French Commune and the German aggression, he confuses two very important but different ideas. The first is the idea of civic nationalism versus ethnic nationalism. Right, so what Kropotkin had done is come to say, look, the ideals of liberty, equality, democracy, all those ideas that were part of the French Revolution and were heralded by the French Commune, Kropotkin associated this with French people and the preservation of French culture and of the French nation. And so Kropotkin says we must defend that legacy of enlightenment democracy from German aggression and militarism. So we must protect them against the German Huns, and he uses this kind of language. And so what's interesting is that Kropotkin fell into the kind of ethnic essentialism that we see, for instance, in the posters up in front. We must protect the Huns from raping and pillaging and so forth. So Malatesta says he has confused these notions of different forms of nationalism. Right? Civic nationalism is the idea of being loyal to various kinds of ideals. For instance, liberty, equality, fraternity, radical democracy, that these can be part of our national heritage. But it's not loyalty to the nation or to the people, but to the political culture. That Kropotkin had been confused about what nationalism can be. I think this is relevant for us to think about because nationalism is still, to this day, a very live ideology. And in fact, the questions about the difference between civic and ethnic nationalism play themselves out, and we're seeing them play themselves out in the conflicts in the Ukraine and the Crimea right now in terms of what is the kind of connection between Crimea and Russia, right, or Eastern Ukraine and Russia, right? What are the connections? What kind of nationalism? And in fact, we also saw these kinds of questions being raised most recently in the referendum in Scotland about independence. Many people were asking, is it really progressive in any kind of way now to talk about nationalism, or is this a regressive ideal, right? Should Scotland be trying to pursue some kind of independence from the UK? What would they gain? And many folks in Scotland were saying, look, you need to realize that in some cases, nationalism can be, in fact, a progressive ideal. Right? Many Scots were saying, look, we are much more liberal than our English overlords, and by being able to free ourselves from this power, right, we can pursue our civic nationalism, which we feel is much of a different sort of political heritage than the English. And so Kropotkin pointed out you need to make this kind of distinction between these different forms of nationalism. He also pointed out, Malatesta, that is saying, look, if you are confused about these forms of nationalism, you will then say things like, Germany is a threat to civilization itself. And Malatesta pointed out, look, right, this is just simply a ridiculous ideal because none of these European powers are particularly progressive and civilized. And he pointed out, if you look at all of the powers that be, Germany is, yes, militaristic and absolutist. Russia is just almost as bad in terms of squelching dissent. France, which is supposed to be the bearer of civilization, Malatesta says, is doing awful things in Africa, right, as a brutal colonial power. And England, right, which is supposed to be the bearer of democracy, is also exploiting its colonies all over the world. So let's not pretend that we're only talking about the European conflict when we think about World War I, Malatesta says. We need to look at the global dimensions of this, and there's no European power that is a bearer of civilization. The other thing, finally, to sort of wrap this up is to say, look, what we need to recognize as anarchists, Malatesta says, is that there is a difference between the state, industrial interests, and the people. And the job of anarchists, he says, is to open up that conceptual space for radical theory. And what he meant is, I think this is, he said, look, what Kropotkin wants us to do is to have a way of defeating the Germans. When the reality is, he says, is that the war is being fueled by what we might call today the war state. Or another way of putting this is the military-industrial complex. Malatesta says this is what we need to think about, are those kinds of connections, those kinds of powers. And the important thing for anarchists to do is to talk about revolution. And what that meant, I think, for Malatesta was to say, look, what will bring liberation, what will bring all those good things that Kropotkin wanted, was in some sense trying to figure out how to reconfigure power relationships between the state, between industry, and the people themselves, the workers. And it would not come about by having these conceptual confusions of nationalism. In fact, it had to be a radical reconceptualization of how democracy works, what the relationship of the state is to these new industrial powers. And I think that this is very much a relevant conversation. Right? The question about the war state, or whether or not we have institutions in our societies that somehow have a vested interest in incentivizing militarism and aggression, right? We have this kind of discussion come out, of course, because of Eisenhower and the notion of the military-industrial complex. But this is precisely what the majority of anarchists were talking about in 1914, that we need to think about these relationships in order to think about liberation. And so what I would say is that these obscure kinds of political debates that I've found actually prefigure a lot of political discourse that we would have much later, and in fact are still very, very relevant today. So if you haven't read your Kropotkin, you don't know anything about Kropotkin and Malatesta, it bears thinking about how these folks are still relevant to us because, as Chris pointed out, so much of 20th century political history is, in some sense, a footnote to World War I. These folks were trying to lay out what they thought, for instance, were really the costs and the ramifications of this particular kind of conflict.